All right. In the interest of time, and because this is such an interesting topic, and we have an all-star panelist with us, I want to get this rolling as soon as possible. Um, uh, First and foremost, to hopefully give time at the end for or question and answers. I think this is going to be a great conversation, great dialogue. This is a topic that you all have been asking for, and so happy to be able to add this amazing group of panelists to talk about this topic. So first of all, James Stark from LISC Safety and Justice. We are helping support the Stop School Violence program, providing specialized TTA training and technical assistance to advance school-based community violence intervention approaches. If you have not already joined our community of practice, um, Matt's going to throw in on the chat again an opportunity to join that on our Stop Resources website. Also, if you have not already had a chance to see some of the prior webinars that we've done, we've had one around data. How do schools and communities utilize data to identify the people and places, the students, the places around schools, in schools, to focus your community violence intervention resources. We've also had a webinar around partnerships. How do schools partner with community partners, community organizations, to engage individuals and family members impacted by community violence, and vice versa. Also, how do community partners that are doing this work in the communities engage schools to make sure that they are part of the ecosystem supporting safety approaches in your neighborhoods. We've also had a webinar around place-based violence intervention. So thinking about the places in schools, also in the community, where students don't feel safe or where violence has been impacting students. And how do we identify those places and think about resources to support those places to reduce the number of incidents of violence. Today, we're going to talk about how trauma impacts students and also community members, schools, and how your schools can be better prepared through policies and protocols to support the students, to support your schools, and to support the community. Before we move forward, want to also acknowledge and thank Bureau of Justice Assistance for funding this important and critical work. And the opinions, findings, and conclusions expressed in this webinar are ours and not necessarily BJA's. So again, welcome. We're going to have a very brief PowerPoint. It's going to be just a few slides. Fear not, though, we have a very large PowerPoint that we're not necessarily going to show. We're not going to go through the details of the PowerPoint during the webinar. We want this to be more of an informal conversation between Dr. Bocanegra, myself, and Marks. And then we're going to have opportunities for questions and answers at the end. We're also going to show the slides. We're going to go run through them very quickly at the end so you know that they're there. This webinar is being recorded. We're going to put it on our website so you'll have access to this conversation as well as the PowerPoint deck after the event concludes, probably in another, maybe end of this week or beginning of next week. So if you're watching it virtually, thank you very much for tuning in. All right. So prior to me introducing our panelists, this topic, we understand that community violence impacts not only the victims and perpetrators, but entire communities and schools. We've heard from a number of school agencies and organizations. You all want to be part of this process. How do we support students? Because we're the ones often engaging those students in the days after a community violence event occurs. And how do we both support the students? How do we support staff and administrators who are often interacting with the students? But also, how do we think about engaging family members? Because sometimes the violence, while it impacts the students, or it might be a result of something students did with each other. It might be part of a generational violence challenge. So today we're going to define trauma. We're going to understand the impact of community violence on brain development. We're going to talk about some of the short-term and long-term impacts of trauma, and how schools can be better prepared through policies and protocols to support students and staff. And we're going to talk about those appropriate trauma responsive policies and practices. So as I said, we have an all-star panel. First, I'd like to welcome Dr. Bocanegra. She is an assistant professor at the John Adams School of Social Work at the University of Illinois, Chicago. She's a licensed clinical social worker and serves as a senior advisor to Illinois Attorney General Kwame Rule on crime victim and violence prevention issues. She has a long history of doing work in the community, publishing book chapters, articles. She's a part of several criminal justice commissions. And her current research focuses on street intervention and trauma exposure, as well as homicide investigation processes. Welcome, Dr. Bocanegra. And then we also have Ann Marks, another all-star. She's a subject matter expert on our team. She was also the executive director of Youth Alive. She helped found HAVI, the Health Alliance for Violence Intervention. She's been invited to the White House to speak on violence intervention, received commendation from the mayor of Oakland and Los Angeles, and has been doing this work in communities throughout the country, training folks, and working with young people impacted by violence, and also the schools that they're attending. So welcome, Ann. All right, so before we get to our discussion, I just want to talk about a couple of keywords. First, throughout this conversation, you're going to hear the word community violence. So how we define that is exposure to intentional acts of interpersonal violence committed in public areas between unrelated individuals who may or may not know each other, generally outside the home. Examples can be assaults, fights, homicides, and they can take place at schools or in the community. We're also going to speak a lot about trauma, and we're defining that as an emotional or psychological response to a deeply distressing or disturbing experience, such as abuse, neglect, or witnessing violence. It can have both an immediate and long-term effects on an individual's well-being. So with that, I'm going to take off the PowerPoint deck, but fear not, as I said before, we have a very long PowerPoint deck with a ton of really great information on there. So I encourage you to check that out. But I want to have a conversation with folks who really understand this issue deeply. Dr. Bocanegra, I'm going to start with you. So we defined trauma, and we know that this type of violence, it can happen in the schools, it can happen on the way to and from schools, it can happen in the community. But let's talk about, just trying to create a foundation for everybody. What is trauma in your words, and what are some of the types of trauma that impact students?
Absolutely. Thank you, James. And I'm so excited to be here, especially with Ann Marks. And I'm a product of Chicago LISC, so indebted to LISC for so much of my career and professional achievements, because my grounding in community practice came from programs and initiatives that were led by the Chicago LISC office. And so, like James said, leading into how I discuss trauma, especially as it relates to violence in students, came from almost 2 decades of experience. First, about a decade in community mental health, and then in community violence intervention and prevention. And throughout that continuity of professional experience as a licensed clinical social worker who has to be trained in these kind of clinical and rigid measures of understanding trauma and the impact of violence on young people. So putting on that clinician hat, the if a young person or a parent were to walk a young person into a clinical office and said, I want to know if my student or my child is experiencing trauma, there is a technical definition that exists in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. It's called the DSM for short. That is that of trauma. And the clinical definition of trauma, which I'm now going to ground in community practice in a little bit, is um, uh, exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence, and that exposure can encompass a few different realms of contact. One can be direct experience, right? Experiencing a traumatic event, personally witnessing an event occur, learning about a traumatic event, and then repeated exposure to that traumatic event. So if we want to talk about young people and their safety in their community and their schools, there's a few different ways in which trauma can be manifest. One is in acute format. So students may experience acute trauma from witnessing or be involved in a violent event in their community, like a shooting or physical assault or a school fight. And this trauma can lead to immediate emotional distress, which can impact their ability to focus in school and participate in activities in their school environment and community. Then there's also chronic trauma. And chronic trauma occurs in the realm of community violence, and that's repeated exposure to violent incidents that it becomes part of their daily life and often normalized. And this ongoing stress can impact their emotional regulation and behavior, leading to challenges keeping healthy and safe relationships with their peers, with their instructors, and staying engaged in school. Next, we have complex trauma, in which multiple forms of violence and stress intersect and overlap in a young person's life. This often comes when a young person is experiencing violence in their home, violence in their community, and also systemic inequality. All of these overlapping forms of trauma and can be compounded and can really significantly inhibit and impair their ability to do well in school, and again to have healthy relationships in and outside of the school and with their family. Then we also have developmental trauma. So I'm trying to add all these dimensions to this, grounded in community practice. Developmental trauma is when one of these forms of stress is experienced that then disrupts what we would call like a normal healthy trajectory. We all know some developmental milestones in the life of a child and an adolescent, and if any of those are disrupted due to a traumatic event, we would call that developmental trauma. Two more manifestations or dimensions of trauma in the life of a young person is secondary trauma. So when they talked about the threat of violence, right, that is a form of secondary trauma in which you're getting kind of like secondhand smoke, but through a secondhand exposure to a traumatic event in your environment, in your home, among your peers. And then lastly, we have historical trauma, which is linked to structural violence. And historical trauma and structural violence impacts entire communities, particularly Black and Brown communities, in which cycles of violence are perpetuated through systemic forms of marginalization and oppression. And historical trauma can manifest in how a young person develops their sense of identity and belonging within the school system, and can create additional barriers to academic success, healthy development, and healthy relationships with their peers and their family.
That's great. Thank you so much for running through all of that. There'll be a test later for everybody on the website. So one of the things that we're often asked is, by school staff and school administrators are like, what are some of the signs that we should be able to recognize in our students, maybe even sometimes in our staff, after violence has happened in a community? So I'm gonna do a two-parter. What are some of the signs that we can recognize short term? And are those the same, different in, say, the weeks afterwards? Is it like kind of manifest differently in the weeks afterwards? So a two-parter for you.
Great question. I'll answer the first question with some general trends that can be observed if somebody's responding from a place of traumatic stress. But I also want to say that the science around this, I would say, is incomplete and often not inclusive of people and communities most impacted by trauma and violence. So when I talk about like clinical models and clinical diagnostic criteria, like that's a starting point. But the way that trauma appears in young people, especially Black and Brown young people, in their families and in their community, should I would say should not be completely tethered to some of these clinical definitions that I'm going to talk about. So some emotional symptoms or like indicators that a young person has been traumatized or is reacting or engaging you from a place of trauma can be related to their emotional functioning. So if you're noticing that they're anxious, depressed, irritable, or experiencing emotional numbness, like that there's something really distressing happening in their environment and they seem to be unaffected by it, right? Or communicating to you feelings of guilt or shame, those are all kind of emotional indicators that a young person may be engaging with you from a place of trauma. But trauma also impacts the way that we think. All right, there are some cognitive symptoms related to trauma. Um, one manifestation of that is something we called intrusive thoughts. So they're trying to concentrate on some task in school, they're trying to concentrate on a project, and these thoughts land on them like a disrupting their train of thought, their concentration, and these intrusive thoughts are often memories or triggers related to the traumatic incident that they're navigating right now. Um, Flashbacks are also a manifestation of cognitive experiences of traumatic stress, and flashbacks are re-experiencing a traumatic event. Another cognitive manifestation of traumatic stress is having trouble concentrating, often connected to those two other things, flashbacks and intrusive thoughts, and also negative beliefs about themselves, about others, and about the world. Lastly, I'll say that often gets overlooked is the physical representation or presentation of traumatic stress, especially in younger children who lack the emotional vocabulary to say like, hey, this awful thing happened to me and this is why I'm acting this way. Young children especially somaticize or speak through their body to communicate that they are stressed and responding to trauma. And those physical symptoms include hyperarousal. So like always being on the edge, always being ready to go. That can get often miscategorized as hyperactivity. Having trouble sleeping at night. So if they're showing up really sleepy in school and falling asleep during class and really drowsy and fatigued, it may be because of they're having sleep disturbances at night associated with that traumatic stress. Physical pain, it's in young children, even adults. It's usually like a headache or a tummy ache, and repeatedly coming to the nurse saying like my stomach really hurts or I have a headache. And then lastly, persistent fatigue because your body is in hyperarousal state all the time. Yeah. So those are some initial indicators. Long term, what this looks like again is that a withdrawal from people and their community and their schools, places that could provide safety and healing to them. There's a withdrawal from these sources because they're chronically misunderstood and often criminalized. So again, a child who's having difficulty concentrating and underperforming in school will get often labeled as lazy or underperforming or falling behind on some kind of standardized measure, when in reality they're operating from a place of traumatic stress. So they'll disengage from school. They will internalize those negative reports and evaluations of their behaviors as like, I am not competent, or this is who I am and I'm not good at this. And you'll see them withdraw from school, which is a place that could provide an opportunity for healing, for support, and for positive identity development.
Thank you, thank you.
Mhm.
And I'm gonna turn to you for a quick second here. Tell us a little bit about your background working at Youth Alive and how some of the community partners that you've been with that you are engaged with support youth in the community, and how that work might be able to support schools as well, because we know that trauma doesn't just impact them in schools, it impacts them on the streets, in the home, when they're not in school.
Um, Great. So programs that I've seen and then sort of how they do it in school and the community. Um, so at Youth Alive, we had a number of programs, and then we had a whole network of programs in our community, and that I've seen work with young people. Some work with young people who are directly impacted by violence. So hospital-based violence intervention is a model that works directly with shooting survivors in the immediate aftermath. And so what you're providing is both sort of immediate support around sort of just the stress of handling that situation, being in the hospital, coming home from the hospital, and then long-term connecting to healing support, right, to recover. So you're both addressing immediate risk, right? Is this person now going to be caught up in a cycle of retaliation that we need to address, but also longer term, this person just went through some trauma. Can we get them connected to resources, either formal clinical or non-formal resources that can help them get on a path to recovery and not have that trauma sort of take them in a path that can be dangerous to them. Similarly, when there's a fatal shooting, so when there's a homicide, there are often young people who are impacted. And so homicide response programs work with the whole family and network of folks around someone who has been killed, offering both sort of that immediate practical assistance, right? Symptom of trauma immediately after a traumatic loss is sort of it impairs your sort of immediate ability, your frontal lobe, right? So you're sort of like, what's next? What do I do? A little bit of brain fog, like, and so just even planning a funeral, having people show up like, hey, groceries now, can be really helpful as you're just navigating that point in time. But also because there's so many young people in these homes and who are friends of people or maybe who have witnessed it directly, providing some support around that whole network of folks. So sort of the immediate, let's get through the funeral, let's get through your victim compensation, let's do some practical stuff, but let's also have a ministry of presence of people who are positive and supportive and care about you and the people around you. We've had a lot of school partners in this work, especially when it's a young person who's either a young person who was at a school who was killed or a young person whose sibling or parent was killed, to wrap around with support groups and acknowledgement within the school. One of the hardest things, right, is when something terrible happens and nobody talks about it. You start to question, you're already having trauma, right? You're maybe having trouble sleeping, or you're seeing things that you wouldn't normally see, right? So you're already questioning your reality a bit. So to have people not acknowledge this can be really tough. So having school partners that acknowledge what happened and offer support has been really helpful in the aftermath of a homicide. I kind of mentioned this in relation to those two things, but another thing you can do after direct experience is have specific retaliation prevention done by violence interrupters. So, violence interrupters in the community are people who have relationships, they're credible messengers. So they, both might have connections to the people who are impacted, but they also might have knowledge about sort of what happened. And one of the things that's important to remember is it doesn't have to, the reason the person got shot could be completely random, or it could be a mistaken identity, it could be anything. But that doesn't mean there won't be retaliation behind it because of the stories that get told within the community about, oh, we think maybe this person was responsible, or this group, or so, and because emotions are heightened, right, in the aftermath of trauma, and hyperarousal is there, right? So the amount of time between thinking and acting is shortened or non-existent. People will start doing things that are dangerous because of that. So having people who really understand, these are the groups that we think might, decide to take action or blame someone, to have people who can understand that and go talk to those groups, sit with them, just give them a little bit of a break, right? Just a moment between thinking something happened and reacting to it can really de-escalate or prevent a retaliation that could have happened, particularly after shootings and homicides. And because often these things that happen in the community are going to spill into the school, this is really important, right? So, you might have someone a shooting in the community, and because the people involved have siblings, right? Well, now those siblings are in it, or because the people involved are parents whose children are at the same school, now they bring it to campus, right? And so it's really important to have violence interrupters who both are familiar with the school but familiar with the community to make sure that those things don't spill over. I sort of said clinical support. I think another important thing is just mental health support in general, right? But it has to be credible, supportive mental health support. One of the hardest things that we found in Oakland, where I'm from, is that we would refer people to mental health, but they wouldn't take it. They would not show up. We'd even say like, no, we'll come bring you, we'll walk you over. And so how mental health support gets introduced and what it means. And so we stopped calling it mental health. We just call it counselors, hey, you want to see a counselor, or making sure there's a credible messenger that can be there with you, try to bring down some barriers. A lot of schools have these resources, but because of the way it is, or because of how public it is to be known, to be going there, it really brings up a lot of barriers for people who don't want to be stigmatized as having mental health issues. But mental health support is really critical, especially in communication with the non-clinical folks who are working with young people. So this is all kind of talking about direct, but mental health also is important for people that are having not direct experiences of trauma or not immediate, recent experiences of trauma. In addition, mentoring and intensive case management. So having, so there are lots of clinical interventions into trauma. For my money and from what I've read, the most effective intervention for trauma with a young person is a positive relationship with a caring adult they can trust. Whatever that looks like. And so mentoring and intensive case management can be that for young people. And a lot of the time what those case managers are working on is not just being that, but connecting them with positive adults and regular peer support that is positive, right? So that people are growing the network of positive influences around them, because that's where healing takes place, right? Is in community, in trusted, caring relationships. So that's an important aspect, I think, of case management. So you may have case management available at your school or through community partners, but it has to be community partners that really understand the context of what a young person is going through, so they can address things like risk factors for violence or involvement in violence. And specifically, not just sort of mentoring case management in general, but really targeting it for not just folks who are directly impacted by violence, but people who might have also be involved in causing harm. So having reentry or probation, life coaching, having it available for students who are at elevated risk because they've been suspended for fighting. So sort of demonstrating some of these trauma symptoms that Dr. Bocanegra described. Maybe students who aren't showing up at school, right? Or showing up, but are showing up in these ways that she described, where they're sort of not responsive, or tired or hyper vigilant. And so, but one of the things that is important about having a community partner is you might have a student who needs you so much, but you can't help them because they're never in school, right? But your community partner can go find them, right? And show up for them and bring them back to school, which is honestly the best place for them. So those are all sort of interventions I talked about that are sort of looking at young people who are, impacted by violence or involved in violence. And I want to also recognize that in communities where impacted by violence, young people are often blamed for violence. And so I want to, really emphasize strongly that young people are not the cause of violence. And in fact, young people are often the solution to violence. And so schools that implement programs that build the violence prevention skills of their young people, the leadership capacity of the young people, that educate young people to make safe choices, are often very successful. So, at Youth Alive, we had a program called Teens on Target that specifically trained young people to be those leaders in their community. I've seen peer conflict mediation programs be really effective in schools, right, to help change the culture and address violence or potential violence. And when you are educating your students about violence, again, you're not going to convince them to do violence by talking about violence. They're experiencing it. What you're giving them is language to understand it and talk about it. I want to emphasize that we talk about community violence and we talk about family and dating violence with young people. So much of the community violence we see actually comes from family violence or dating violence incidents that then grow because of the networks of people around them into community violence. And so it's really important to give folks the language around that so they understand what they're seeing in their home or what they're seeing in their own or their friends' relationships, so they then know how to articulate it and get help. I have some other thoughts, but I realize I've been talking a while, so I'm going to stop right there.
No, those were a ton of amazing nuggets that you dropped in there. A lot of really useful tools. Digging a little bit deeper into specific roles and titles. Like, so if I'm a school and I'm like, wow, this is super interesting. Like, who from my school should be connecting with your organization? And like, what are some of the familiar titles of folks that are doing work in the community that schools should be aware of and be like, all right, if something just happened, like I need to talk to this organization and talk to a person that does what. So maybe just provide a little bit of specifics around like what are the titles of the schools? And the other thing is we're also working with the folks on this call. We're going to have some that are from large cities, and then we're going to have some that are from rural communities or from cities that might get impacted by a few homicides per year. So maybe also talking a little bit about, if they don't necessarily have an established CVI program.
Frozen, but frozen in a charming way. About to say something really amazing.
Maybe, Anne, do you want to start answering with some of the
You
titles?
were, hello?
Way
Am I
back.
back?
Oh, unfrozen.
All right, figures, All right, back to the questions. One, what are the titles in the schools that you work with? And what are some of the titles of community-based partners that they should know of?
Yeah. So whoever's doing like a coordination of service team, whoever's doing that within a school. So it could be guidance counselors, it could be your security team, obviously administration, whoever is on your campus that is talking about sort of additional services outside of your classwork, right, for families and students, and who's ever doing that coordination, that's who should be there. After school programs, representatives, that's who generally, CVI or external providers should be connected with and really integrated in. So, your back to school events, we're there. Your tabling at lunchtime at the beginning of the year, we're there. But, have a real presence on campus as much as possible for these folks, because it sort of sends a message that we're always there. It's not just because something horrible has happened, but we can be there, and you can trust us. And then in terms of
Not for you, this for the, sorry. Yeah,
okay.
for folks who are on the call, as you're listening to this, like, are there specific
Yeah.
titles in the schools that you
Right.
want to talk about?
Right.
Right.
Sometimes it's a dean, right? They're fielding a lot of issues from students, so they have a better sense of what yeah, right, who needs what. And then in terms of external providers, so like if you're in a community that has a violence interruption program, great. If you're not, you may have a program that is known for being a youth serving program that works with young people who are who face a lot of challenges, right? So it could be a case management program, it could be a mentorship program. The terms life coaching for intensive case management we hear. So look for those kinds of programs that are trusted and who have staff that are from the community that you're in. Because that's what you need is you need people who can really have relationships in the community to broker conversations, to get information, and to build relationships quickly with young people and their families when they're needed. I mean, that's really the special thing that these organizations can bring that schools can't bring, because you don't generally get the chance to leave campus and go to people's homes and communities in the same way.
Perfect. Yeah, I feel like they're called many different things in communities, but like community impact meetings, you have sometimes there's like a prosecution. The prosecutors sometimes have meetings with inside schools, and then they're much more less formal in the schools where they have just a couple
social
of
workers,
administrators, counselors, and then a couple of community-based organizations. Sometimes they have parents, sometimes they have students on those teams. But yeah, it just depends on the school. So this is really helpful. So now let's Dr. Bokenegger, I'm going to turn to you on this question. I've seen policies and protocols kind of vary across the board in schools in the immediate aftermath of community violence. Um, and I think, and I'm going to preface this again with our audience. So we have some that are from major cities and some of them from our, that aren't impacted as much by violence. But I feel like there's a lot of lessons to be learned about, who's doing it well and how it's being done well. Um, because one of the things I often hear is that schools don't necessarily know how to respond or who to communicate with, or they they want to just involve like there's also legal implications about conversations. And I know one school we were talking with, like the students were like, yeah, we all know what happened, but the school didn't want to even talk about it or acknowledge it. So I know you've done some research in this area. Tell us about kind of the historical perspective of how schools have tended historically to address this, and now shifting into current days, like what are some lessons learned and how are some schools doing this better than others?
That's a great question. And I think to bridge with the dialogue that happened with the previous question around what are helpful prevention and intervention strategies. Um, the people who I think are kind of gatekeepers to trauma responsive practice in the school are usually the ones who are charged with um, safety and responding to incidents of misconduct in school. So it's usually like around behavioral issues and safety issues, which frequently are like your school resource officers and like an assistant principal or an associate dean who has to deal with all the behavioral issues. So those are the people who I think have um, a direct line to the students who are most traumatized, because the issues that are presented to your school resource officers and to your dean of students or your assistant principals are usually um, trauma masked as aggressive behavior, non-compliant behavior, and academic underperforming. All right. Um, so in the past, there have been, when issues around student misconduct has occurred, violence inside and outside the school facility has occurred, the tendency of many school districts has been to punish students through suspensions and expulsions and essentially push them out of that school environment because they present a risk to the functioning of the school environment. Um, that is now recognized as what they call the school to prison pipeline, which are a series of practices and policies that criminalize students and create a conveyor belt from school systems directly into jails and prisons, etc. So there's an awareness of this school to prison pipeline dynamic that disproportionately impacts Black and Brown students and that disproportionately impacts traumatized students, right? And so the push within practice and research and advocacy communities has been to like, what else can exist if students are having issues in school and fighting with each other? There's issues of violence outside of the school stemming from stuff happening inside of our school. What other recourse do we have other than to get them out of the school? And so there are a few different options to consider in an alternate to create alternatives to the school to prison pipeline. One has already been thoroughly emphasized, which is partnering with community organizations. It doesn't have to all be on the school to figure this out. Like Anne said, you have Native, Indigenous peacemakers in your community with an in-depth knowledge of the challenges experienced by the students, because especially with community violence intervention organizations, they have been through it themselves. So they are uniquely capable of reaching these students and understanding their needs and getting them connected to supportive, caring adult relationships and keeping them in school. All right. So partnering with community organizations is a strategy to disrupt that pipeline. Increasing access to mental health resources, both inside and outside of the school, under whatever name is most accessible, if it's counseling, if it's behavioral health supports, etc. Creating safe spaces inside the school and outside of the school as well. So what does a safe space for a student look like inside of school? In some of the high schools that I have worked in, when I was working in community mental health and violence intervention and prevention, include arts-based spaces in which students have expressive outlets to describe what their experience is and channel that in a positive way through the engagement of arts, which I love. Student-based advocacy groups in which students are sat down with organizers and people who work on policy and systems change to say what you've experienced, what injustices you have internalized, there's actually like we want to empower you and work with you to change those systems. So let's help you, first of all, unpack what you've been through, connect that to systems and structures, and then encourage you and accompany you on that path so that your experiences can change the future for somebody else and your classmates and even your own narrative. And then laced throughout everything I just said around mental health resources and community organizations are restorative practices. So using opportunities for peer-to-peer mediations, restorative justice circles like peacekeeping circles and conferencing is really powerful tool in school in which students are able to resolve conflicts without engaging law enforcement, without resorting to violence, and restoring the harm and disruption of social ties that included those students and their peers. So you're actually like disrupting retaliatory violence that can spill out into the community by using restorative and peer-led processes in the school, because like Anne said, youth are brilliant and uniquely capable of resolving their conflicts if given the tools and the space to do so, rather than stripping them of their autonomy and their voice. And I just want to note that I agree with neurodivergent students increasingly providing resources and spaces first to create supportive learning environments, to educate instructors and teachers on working with neurodivergent students so that their behaviors aren't criminalized and pushed out of the classroom as well. Incredibly important. I want to thank the person who made the comment about neurodivergent students and families.
I always do that once a webinar. And I'm gonna flip over to you. One of the things I think is important is having policies and protocols where schools and community partners, when they have a sense that something is going to happen, or in the immediate aftermath of an event, like having clear communication channels to make sure, hey, I just saw somebody texted somebody or put up something on social media. We're aware of it. Are you aware of it? So that, you know, after school hours that somebody's monitoring or just connecting, saying, hey, James, you know, I know you posted something, just want to be there and see what's going on. Tell us a little bit about, you know, relationships between community partners and schools, and you know what's worked well, and how do you make sure that there's what I call proactive intervention that's happening.
Sure. I mean, some of these things we've touched on, right? Which is how important it is for these external partners to have relationships with school leadership and key folks, security, school resource officers, right? The folks that are going to be aware of things as they happen, to define sort of clear roles. So, you know, the school can do a lot, but they can't do everything. The community partner, you know, needs to have identified lanes when they'll be called, where they are welcome, what parts of the school they have access to, ideally in an MOU or something written down, right? But so that people know exactly sort of what the protocol will be. But just having a protocol isn't enough. You have to have a regular relationship. So regular meetings to do case conferencing, just being around campus, right? When there isn't drama, right? So there's a familiarity, like these folks are here. And maybe being part of staff development, so people understand what they do and how they intervene, being part of the yearly planning and assessment meetings. And to go back to a point that Dr. Bocanegra and I both made, having students as your partners, right? I mean, talk about a credible messenger, right? Like a student in the school, they're the ones that are going to be the first to know what's happening on social media that might bubble into something, right? You start working with them, and gain their trust, right? They can service things for you that you don't even realize are going to bubble into something else, and they can themselves, right? Given proper support. So I think all those things are important. I think, what doesn't work, right, is sort of doing too much or too little. So either you're calling community partners all the time for every little thing, and it's just not within their area of expertise, or you're just not acting them at all because you're like, we got this. So I think, it's really sort of being able to clarify sort of what the roles are. In Oakland, we got rid of school police, and became a real question about, well, now we really have to communicate, because that was the one size fits all answer to every incident. And what we found is many of these incidents we were sort of dealing with without police in the first place. We just weren't explicit about what we were doing. Right. And so it was really about like, okay, who's the number to call? How do we call them? What information do they need before they show up? So that they can show up safely. And what is the moment where we say, and now we are actually calling the police, right? Like, this was a fight, it was fine, but then there was a weapon involved, or then people that didn't go to the school showed up on campus. Like, there are reasons to sort of extend beyond it, but we have to all be on the same page about it, because what you don't want to do is call the police too soon or too late.
Terrific. One of the questions too that a lot of schools have is the very basic one, like, what is community violence intervention, and how is this any different than the resources that we typically get? So I'm gonna pose this to both of you and have Dr. Bokenegger kind of focus on the schools, and then Ann focus on the communities. So how is CVI resources different than your traditional money that's going into school? So, if you have like a CVI grant program, you're probably already, before you even have CVI, you're probably already have some sort of safety protocols. You have, counselors. You might have a community engagement team in the schools, but now you have these CVI resources. How can this supplement or do something a little bit different than your traditional school resources?
Great question. And I'll begin my response with a brief story, because I was in the situation that you're describing right now. So when I was a community mental health practitioner, I often got referrals from school-based counselors. And I got a call from a school-based counselor about a student who had recently had a colostomy as a result of being shot in the back. And he was shot in the back in the aftermath of his brother's murder. So he had lost his brother. He was out in the community. He got shot in the back. Now was coming to school with a bag, and was completely just, I'm using the terms of the resource counselor, was like, he's disruptive, he's failing, he's picking fights with students. And the school counselor said, I don't feel like I can reach him, so he must need somebody more clinical. And that's why they referred him to me as a mental health practitioner. But I sat down with this young man for 3 weeks, and the responses, it was one word responses for an entire hour. And I tried all the therapeutic techniques that I had learned in all of my education, and nothing was creating an inroad with him. So I called a community violence intervention outreach worker, and said, and I asked the young man first for his consent. I said, next time you come by, would it be okay if I had a friend and a colleague from the community come? He does this kind of work. And he's like, yeah, whatever. And so I invited the outreach worker to come, and he showed up. And in that 1 hour, I said one word and the outreach worker asked one question, and it was a complete offloading of all the burden and trauma that this young man had experienced, because he felt connected to that outreach worker. And he's like, you get it. And I now feel safe to be able to tell you all the things I'm carrying in and why I'm showing up at school this way. So to answer your question, what is like the added benefit of these community partnerships, in particular community violence and intervention work? The outreach worker that I connected this young man with then checked in on him every single day, knew his community, was usually working in non-traditional hours, not the 9 to 5, but in the afternoons and evenings, was available for crisis calls if he ever felt like he was in a dangerous situation or in a bind, was available for troubleshooting and thinking about, like, I know I want to do this, or my friend is asking me to do this, but I don't want to do that because that could be a risk to my safety or somebody else's. Who can I call? that won't criminalize me, who would understand and help me make a better decision. So that is essentially what a community violence intervention outreach worker can do. And you can set up a system within schools in which they're able to connect with your students, and you develop a good communication channel so that they know who they're working with and what they're working on and how they're trying to keep them safe. Yeah.
And I'm gonna pose this to Ann, but before I do that, I want folks on the call to think about your questions for Ann and Dr. Bocanegra, because after this question, I want to open it up to the audience to ask your own question and answer. So feel free to either put the question in the chat or the Q&A bar, or raise your hand and we'll take you off mute and allow you to ask the question. But before that, last question for Ann. One of the so there's a number of communities that are getting community violence intervention money. And then there are a number of communities that might just have like a Boys and Girls Club or a couple of anchor institutions that don't necessarily have CVI money. But those communities are always saying we really need to be able to get engaged more with the schools. They're having connections with students and oftentimes family members on a daily basis that sometimes we just aren't able to do. How does your organization utilize CVI money, or how do you see community-based organizations utilize CVI money to bring schools into the mix, and why is that important for CVI?
So, first of all, what a beautiful description from Dr. Bocanegra of the impact, right, of having someone who's in the community violence intervention field connect with a young person. And so this is a little bit to your question, James, sort of what is it we're trying to do? We're trying to acknowledge, right, what people who work in schools already know, which is that the school and the community are not two separate entities. It is a very permeable, right, distinction. And so things that happen in your school bleed out into the community, and things that happen in the community are going to show up on campus. And so it's essential to have people who understand the community, who either already have relationships, who always already have relationships, but in places where they don't, are so familiar with these communities that they are able to build relationships and assert trust in a way, right, that even the most skilled clinician, like Dr. Bocanegra, couldn't with a young person who showed up, right? That even the most skilled teacher cannot, in a way that someone who is, a credible messenger, a community member from the community can, because they understand the context and they have already developed the relationships. So that, I think, is really a key component. So whatever that looks like in your community, having the school make those relationships. And then I think, with access to resources like some of which you provide, right? Those Boys and Girls Clubs, those whatever they are in your community, they'll have people engaged with them, connected to them, either as staff or volunteers who, are these native healers, right? That are already doing some of this work, that already have, unfortunate experience with some of these issues around violence. And so, with some skill building, can turn that experience into really dynamic support of both young people to help them stabilize the aftermath of violence, in terms of education to help them make positive choices in a context of violence, and in peacemaking, in terms of helping broker resolution to conflicts that are arising that either come from violence or will result in future violence. And so I don't know if that exactly answers your question, but I think there's a number of ways where if by having these external partners, you're acknowledging, right, that this is already happening. And so we have to be there for young people. On the other side, right, CVI programs rely on schools because schools are such a positive, stable element to our communities. And so it's a safe place for people to go to. And I think, if you know trauma-informed care, having a safe place is an essential component to healing, right? Having a stable place, having some place that is there, is where people care about you and where you can expect the same thing to happen every day, is essential. And so, CVI organizations really rely on schools as partners be that sort of caring, holding container for young people who are experiencing a lot of things out in the community.
And I always have one more question. I'm like Columbo, one more question. I know I said we're gonna open up to everybody, but I'd be remiss if, Anne is an expert on hospital-based intervention programs. How can schools connect with hospitals? Hospitals might be like that first point of contact after somebody is shot or stabbed. They're engaging the individual who's been impacted by violence, oftentimes the family members and the friends. And what's the intersection between schools, hospitals, and sometimes community violence interruption organizations?
Yeah, well, so many communities don't have a hospital-based violence intervention program, right? So if you did, I would say connect with that program. That would be the perfect point of entry for that. And some programs are operated solely out of the hospital. Some are operated in partnership with a community-based organization, like my old organization, Youth Alive. Right, so that would be a good entry point. If that does not exist, I would start with most young people who are injured will probably not be seen by the Children's Hospital, because that type of trauma tends to be seen by the adult hospital. But I would still start with whatever the Children's Hospital is in your area, and I'll start with either injury prevention. If there's an injury prevention, if it's a trauma center, they'll have to have someone who's assigned to injury prevention, and then I'd start with if there's nothing there, population health or just external affairs. You can use resources that are available from the Health Alliance for Violence Intervention, just as a starting point, but sort of to say, like, we're a school that is impacted by violence. And so, how do we communicate? A lot of these children's hospitals also have not just a hospital, but have clinics that are utilized, right? And often have strong connections already with schools. And so they offer not just sort of the medical resources, but also the behavioral health, mental health resources for young people. So it's a good connection to have even outside the context of, sort of the immediate aftermath of injury. But that's where I would start.
Very good, very good. All right, I'm gonna share my screen real quick, just to let folks know that we really do have a PowerPoint deck. So I'm gonna fly through this very quickly to let you all know. After the webinar concludes, we're gonna work on getting it posted to our website, where you'll have access to all of these slides. So we have discussion about the impact of community violence on youth development, brain development, emotional behavioral health, long-term effects, life outcomes, cognitive and academic performance, behavioral issues in the schools, emotional regulation, the relationship with teachers and peers, the personal impact of violence, and also the community impact of violence. So it's not just personal, but it's also the community is feeling the impacts of violence. Also, terms that you all have heard in schools, ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, and how that can impact students. Secondary traumatic stress, something your teachers and staff are often familiar with. Also, historical trauma, racial trauma, different types of trauma that is impacting your schools. This is something that's important for teachers and administrators. The vicarious trauma and burnout, the impact of teachers and working with students that have been impacted by violence, the increased job stress and the mental health strain that impacts staff and administrators. Also, thinking about ways to better manage your classroom and school, resource strain. I know a lot of schools have said, we just don't have a ton of resources to be able to support this work. We also included some school-centered policies and practices, some of the trauma-informed training for staff. So thinking about professional development opportunities, creating these safe and supportive learning environments. Also talking about, I know Dr. Bocanero talked about calming rooms. Talk about mental health services, social emotional learning. And then in the community, working with these cultural brokers, community messengers, who they are and how they can support the schools. Family engagement is always critical. How do we better engage the family to support students? building these community networks, having emergency and crisis response plans so that, when something happens, we know who to engage, how to engage them, and what the roles are. Some specific types of programs could be restorative justice, peace circles, safe spaces, case management, working with community-based organizations, creating these youth leadership teams. And some of these the key takeaways that we want to make sure you all think about. First and foremost, schools and neighborhoods are connected. Similarly, schools and community violence are also connected, and the importance of connecting with community violence intervention organizations, understanding the role of community credible messengers. They're often folks that young people trust, sometimes more than teachers, sometimes maybe more than their own parents. Schools need to plan before an incident occurs, so you know what to do and who to call. Proactively engage with community-based organizations, define roles, create MOUs, and tailor life coaching to the high-risk students. So ultimately, we want to create a school community that understands the trauma has biological and psychological effect on students, is committed to educating and preparing school staff, provides a safe space for healing, and connects with community partners. As a reminder, there's a couple of QR codes. First one, this is where the webinar and PowerPoint will be. Give us a couple of days to put it on the website. But in the interim, if you want to ask specific questions, please use the QR code on the right to submit a TTA request, and somebody from our team will get back to you right away.
Can I add something, James? That just
yeah.
your PowerPoint kind of reminded me. So I think, it's tough. You go to a webinar like this and you are, I mean, obviously if you're here, it's because you care and you want to do something in your, in your community, in your school. And then you're like, oh my God, there's like 1,000 things on this list to do. So I would say this. So if you want to be healing centered, trauma informed, right? First thing to do, and you're already doing it, is learning and understanding trauma. The second thing to do is just don't punish or re-traumatize your students for showing symptoms of trauma. So don't even add in services. If you can just, first of all, just work on not punishing or re-traumatizing folks for showing the symptoms of trauma that we know they will have, given, the threatening, stressful experiences that they are, like violence that they are having, that is a huge starting point. From there, you can start building in ways to actually care for them and promote healing, right? In ways that promote things like, talk about like peacefulness, senses of safety, understanding, having more control of their environment. But I think, if you just start with the, let's find a way to not punish or re-traumatize folks, you're doing much better than most places.
That's a great point, Ann. Thank you so much for that. One last thing, if you've tuned into this webinar, you're interested in how community violence intervention approaches can support your schools. We're going to be creating opportunities to work with specific schools over the next couple of months. So if your school or if your community-based organization is interested in some direct training and technical assistance from our team and this amazing group of subject matter experts that we have with us, please email me. I'm going to put in my email in the chat, and let me know that you're interested, and we can talk to you about potential opportunities to provide some direct TA to your school. So that's the end of the more formal part. I want to open it up to the audience. Again, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat or raise your hand. I did see a question in the chat from kind of the beginning. Lorena had asked, what specific services programs are available for students who have witnessed violence or gang violence? This is for either one of you. Like, is there, what kind of specific, so if a student has witnessed violence in the schools, like, what is there in the school and what is there in the community to support the students? And that probably varies based upon the school, but generally.
Okay, so I'm gonna. It depends. Did they witness it? Someone they knew or someone they did not know, right? So I would it's just some clarifying pieces. So I think the first thing to do is show them grace within the school system. They're going to be showing up in a very messed up way for a period of time. And then I would go back to, you know, trauma response, right? And what is helpful. So as much as possible, can you take them out of chaotic situations on campus and put them in calmer, less stressful situations on campus? As much as possible, can you make sure that you are their basic needs, eating, able to have an area to focus and work on the homework that they need to do? Are they able to get back and forth to school? So that's just right for that immediate aftermath, calming down. Then I would think about, is this a young person who already has someone they trust on campus, right? A teacher, a mentor, you know, some professional. Can that person be the one that starts the process of connecting with them and starting to assess if we can get them connected to longer term services, right? Whether that's case management or clinical counseling or both. And then is there a community organization, right, that is in their neighborhood that can connect with them? Whatever that young person is dealing with, their whoever they live with, right, in their home is also dealing with it, either because they saw it or because they are now dealing with a young person who is, you know, dramatically impacted. And so if those resources are available on campus, communicate that. If those resources are not available on campus, bring in a community partner that can connect them to those resources. It is not a bad idea to think about acknowledging what happened on the campus. Again, I don't know who this happened to or who it was, but if the person who was injured or killed is known, I think you know, being thoughtful about, is there a space on campus where we can acknowledge, right, the loss of someone who meant something to people, to start to normalize, right, that this is traumatic, this is something that brings on grief, can be helpful. And then to the extent that there are others on campus that maybe are experiencing, you know, or we're also witnesses or near the person who this happened to, think about whether you want to do circles, either clinically supported or non-clinical circles of support for young people, you know, on campus or after school, to talk about what happened.
Or if I could just add one more plug for a program that I think checks a lot of the boxes and can be set up for free pretty easily, are safe passage programs, or they go under a lot of different names. I've also heard parent patrol is like a word for it. But the idea of a young person who's witnessed or been exposed to gang violence is that their safety has been compromised and that they will react from a place of feeling unsafe. That could mean they stop showing up at school, or in school they're acting out, underperforming, all of those things. So the idea behind safe passage programs is to put caring adults in and around school, primarily outside of school, in the areas where young people are most likely to encounter that kind of violence. And that caring adult not only shows a presence and can potentially mitigate the presentation of that kind of violence, but keeps students connected to their school environment and feeling safe coming into and out of school. In Chicago, they propped up our safe passage programs after a very high profile murder of a student. And they noticed that attendance was dropping dramatically in a lot of our public high schools. They funded safe passage programs to pay parents and caring adults to stand in and outside of the school facilities in areas where they're most likely to encounter that kind of violence. Well, then I heard in the neighborhood that I was working in at that time from our elementary schools, well, we have sixth graders, fourth graders who are encountering the same thing, but there isn't that support available for them. So then as a community organization, we just met with our groups of parents who were concerned and wanted to do something, and basically train them in the safe passage model. And they set up their own volunteer parent patrol safe passage program. And they noticed that their attendance issues went away, that students were staying engaged and safe in the school environment. So that's also a way to start addressing that issue.
That's a great plug for an upcoming webinar. In the next couple of months, we're going to be doing a safe passage webinar. We're going to also have a second webinar, and it's going to be on what we call restorative mentoring. So this is a program that's been utilized in Spokane, Washington, where they engage young people who are, because of disciplinary reasons, either going to be suspended or expelled, and connect them with a restorative mentor. And I call it restorative mentoring. It's not really a thing, but it's restorative practices, but it's also connecting with a mentor to support that student. So you're kind of removing this school to prison pipeline. It's also making sure that we're keeping students in schools, connected with folks, with a credible, trusted adult. And those are going to be the specific supports, the TTA that we're going to be providing to schools from basically January through September that we want to be able to connect you with. So if those two types of programs really are interesting, like definitely connect with me and we'll get you on a list. I don't see any questions right now, so that just means I'm going to ask more questions. And I want
Can I say
to.
one more thing related to the young person who was witnessed this?
Go ahead.
Dr. Bokenegger talked about, secondary trauma, right? And I want to just acknowledge that you as, school staff, faculty, administrators are experiencing that, right? Through the experiences of your young people. And so an incident like this, like, I don't know, the person who asked it, like what they're going through, but I want to be really thoughtful and attentive to also caring for your staff in the aftermath of these events, because if you can't attend to how it's impacting you, not whether it's impacting you, it is impacting you, right? That is science. You can't hear about these things and it doesn't impact you. So if you're not attending to how it impacts you and your colleagues, right, you're going to really struggle to be there for your young people. So to be really thoughtful about sort of the ways that you need to provide care and healing for your own team.
Very good. While I'm going to ask this other question, I'm going to add because we did have a piece that we put on the website for another program around secondary traumatic stress. I'm going to add that to in the links in 1 second.
Cool. Anything else we can plug for you, James? Or
Yeah. What?
Anything else we can plug for you?
Just a minute. There's always more. All right, we got one question from Sean with the efficacy of mentoring and intensive case management for quote unquote high risk youth. What help or advice can you provide in terms of gaining acceptance from and access to schools as credible messengers with conviction histories? This is a great question. Thank you, Sean.
I would love to begin to answer this because we encountered this in Chicago. So the student incident that I referenced was the murder of Darian Albert outside of Fenger High School. And our public school system unleashed a whole slew of restorative and trauma responsive programs and initiatives called the Culture of Calm Initiative. It was evaluated, mixed findings, but overall it's found to really benefit school safety and student trauma recovery. But the biggest issue was schools were resistant to engaging community partners that may have staff and program people who were previously involved in the streets, who had criminal convictions, because they thought if the whole point is for me to make sure our school is a safe environment and you want somebody who previously compromised the safety of our community to come in and work with my students, how can I guarantee that they won't undermine our goal here of school safety and trauma recovery? So I want to acknowledge that up front, and that most school districts have really strict hiring policies around criminal backgrounds and what would bar somebody from being employed by a school district. But those same hiring practices and policies does not mean that you can't have somebody from the community come in and provide programs. So it's not a no-go. It's an acknowledgement of that, and that it required for us to have the strategy that we had to overcome that was a series of one-on-one meetings with all of the principals, with all the district coordinators, with the school resource officer. So just really prioritizing relationship building within schools so they know who we were, what our goal was, what we would be doing, and what our shared interests were in that space. And the other key ingredient to success in building those community partnerships was we set up a consistent and transparent communication strategy. So we said every Friday at 3 o'clock, we will be here, our whole team. We'll talk about what's happened. If you have questions, if you're hearing things from students, if there's something caught on a camera that you were really like, what was that all about? We will have those discussions so that it wasn't like they weren't just granting carte blanche and access to the school without any level of accountability or transparency. And we similarly were showing up consistently to show that we were committed to the same goals. So that's a strategy to overcome that, but it takes time and relationship building and a good communication infrastructure.
I mean, I think you kind of said it. Like, this is part of the reason you want to work with CBOs, because they can hire people that are credible messengers that you can't hire because of various laws, right, onto your teams at school.
We had a community-based partner who was running into that challenge. And one of the things that they did with the schools that they were connected with was work out an agreement where they would pair the person with a criminal record with another staffer that was allowed access to the schools. And that helped the schools feel a little bit more comfortable and address some of the legal issues. So, also think creatively, because some of these individuals are going to be the most credible and have the most impact on your students, and sometimes even on your staff as well.
Right. And the people who are showing up, who are based on your campus, don't have to be the same as the people that are working with your young people in the community.
Any other questions? If not, before, as a survey, as you leave here, there's going to be a survey tool. Please respectfully, we'd love for you to fill out that survey. Let us know how we did, where there are areas of potential improvement, or if you want them back again for a second time, let us know. Otherwise, seeing no other questions, and Dr. Bocanegra, you dropped a ton of really terrific nuggets, and thank you very much for participating and supporting schools and supporting community violence intervention efforts throughout the country. Thank you. Everyone, have a great afternoon.